Good day to everyone. For this video, we are going to discuss one of the, shall I say, more popular crimes in the revised penal code, which is the crime of rape. Popular because even laymen have an idea or two what this crime is. Now, let us go to the provision itself, Article 266-A. When and how rape is committed. Rape is committed, number one, by a man who shall have carnal knowledge of a woman under any of the following circumstances. Letter A, through force, threat, or intimidation. Letter B, when the offended party is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious. Letter C, by means of fraudulent machination or grave abuse of authority. And letter D, when the offended party is under 12 years of age or is demented, even though none of the circumstances mentioned above be present. These are the elements of rape. First element, the offender is a man. Second element, the offender, who is a man, has carnal knowledge of a woman. And third element, that such act, meaning the act of carnal knowledge, is accomplished under any of the following circumstances. Letter A, through force, threat, or intimidation. Or letter B, when the woman is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious. Or letter C, by means of fraudulent machination or grave abuse of authority. Or letter D, when the woman is under 12 years of age or demented, even though none of the circumstances mentioned above be present. Let us discuss each of these elements in the succeeding slides. I am showing to you a picture of a normal male anatomy consisting of a penis and testicles of a male person. Why am I showing this picture? I am showing this because this is in relation to our discussion of the first element. And what is that first element? That the offender must be a man. The term man refers to the male species who has a sexual organ called a penis. Take note that for this kind of rape, the offender must always be a man, meaning he must be anatomically male. Question. Paano Fiscal yung mga babae na nagpa-transplant para malagyan ng ari ng lalake? Are they included in the definition of the term man for purposes of rape under the first paragraph of Article 266-A of the Revised Penal Code? The answer is no. They will be liable instead for the crime of sexual assault under the second paragraph of Article 266-A because in this crime, the crime of sexual assault, the offender can be a man or a woman, and the rape can be committed by inserting any instrument or object into the genital or anal orifice of another person. Yung artificial na ari ng mga babae na nagpa-transplant ay kasali sa definition ng instrument for purposes of the crime of sexual assault. I am showing to you another picture. This time, this is a picture of the external genitalia of a woman. You can see here the vaginal opening, the clitoris, the mons pubis, and the two labias, the labia majora and the labia minora. Now, why am I showing this picture? I am showing this because this is in relation to our discussion of the second element. And what is that second element? That the offender, who is a man, has carnal knowledge of a woman. Meaning to say, the term woman refers to the female species who has a sexual organ called a vagina. Now, for this kind of rape under Article 266-A, Paragraph 1, the victim must always be a woman, meaning to say she must be anatomically female. Question: paano yung mga lalaki fiscal na nagpa-transplant para malagyan ng ari ng babae? Are they included in the definition of the term woman for purposes of rape under the first paragraph of Article 266-A of the Revised Penal Code? The answer is no. Moreover, if what is inserted into the artificial vagina of a transgender is a real penis of a man, the crime, at best, can only be acts of lasciviousness. It is neither rape nor sexual assault because in rape, the offended party must be anatomically female, while in the crime of sexual assault, what is to be inserted into the genital orifice of another person, in this case the artificial vagina, must be an instrument or object. And a penis is not an instrument or object. I am talking about a real penis. Now, if what is inserted into the artificial vagina of a transgender is an instrument or object, let's say an artificial penis of a woman who had sex reassignment surgery in order to become male, then the crime could be sexual assault. Before proceeding with our discussion of the elements of rape under the first paragraph of Article 266-A, let us first familiarize ourselves with the external female genitalia. Now, the pudendum or vulva is the collective term for the female genital organs that are visible in the perineal area, as what you can see in the picture. It comprises the mons pubis, the labia majora, labia minora, the hymen, the clitoris, and the vaginal orifice, of course. Now, the mons pubis is that rounded eminence that becomes hairy after puberty and is instantly visible within the surface. The next layer is the labia majora, or the outer lips of the female organ, composed of the outer convex surface and the inner surface. The skin of the outer convex surface is covered with hair follicles and is pigmented, while the inner surface is a thin skin which does not have any hair but has many sebaceous glands. And directly beneath the labia majora is the labia minora, or the inner lips of the vagina. What does carnal knowledge in consummated rape mean? Carnal knowledge has been defined as the act of a man having sexual bodily connections with a woman. Sexual intercourse. Now, an essential ingredient thereof is the penetration of the female sexual organ by the sexual organ of the male. Penetration of the vagina by the penis of the man. Now, in cases of rape, however, mere proof of the entrance of the penis into the labia of the pudendum or lips of the vagina is sufficient to constitute a basis for conviction, as ruled in the case of People versus Bormeo. Also take note that carnal knowledge does not require full penile penetration of the female. Hindi kailangang maipasok talaga yung ari ng lalaki dun sa ari ng babae. The mere touching of the external genitalia by a penis capable of consummating the sexual act is sufficient to constitute carnal knowledge. All that is necessary to reach the consummated stage of rape is for the penis of the accused capable of consummating the sexual act to come into contact with the lips of the pudendum of the victim. This means that the rape is consummated once the penis of the accused capable of consummating the sexual act touches either labia of the pudendum, as ruled in the case of People versus Reyes. So, ang ibig sabihin lang nito is, for as long as nagkaroon ng contact yung matigas na ari ng lalaki, erect penis, dun sa labia ng vagina ng babae, either labia majora or labia minora, it is enough to consummate the crime of rape. Hindi kailangang maipasok talaga yung ari ng lalaki dun sa ari ng babae. In the same case of People versus Reyes, the Supreme Court clarified, however, that the touching that constitutes rape does not mean mere epidermal contact, or stroking or grazing of organs, or a slight brush or a scrape of the penis on the external layer of the victim's vagina or the mons pubis, but rather the erect penis touching the labias or sliding into the female genitalia. Accordingly, the conclusion that touching the labia majora or the labia minora of the pudendum constitutes consummated rape proceeds from the physical fact that the labias are physically situated beneath the mons pubis or the vaginal surface, such that for the penis to touch either of them is to attain some degree of penetration beneath the surface of the female genitalia. It is required, however, that this manner of touching of the labias must be sufficiently and convincingly established. So as you can see in this picture, kung ang nangyari is the rubbing of the penis lang on the vaginal surface or on the area near the mons pubis or on the mons pubis itself, or even if ang nangyari is dun lang ang penetration or dun lang ang touching na nangyari sa may clitoris portion ng babae, ng vagina ng babae, it will not be considered as consummated rape. At the very least, it will be considered as attempted rape only. It will only be considered as consummated rape if the erect penis reaches either the labia majora or the labia minora, or more so, it reaches the vaginal opening. And please be reminded that the mere touching of the penis with either of the labias is enough to consummate the crime of rape. Hindi kailangang maipasok talaga yung ari ng lalaki dun sa ari ng babae or dun sa vaginal opening. Jurisprudence dictates that the labia majora must be entered for rape to be consummated, and not merely for the penis to stroke the surface of the female organ. Thus, a grazing of the surface of the female organ or touching the mons pubis of the pudendum is not sufficient to constitute consummated rape. Absent any showing of the slightest penetration of the female organ, for example, the touching of either labia of the pudendum by the penis, there can be no consummated rape. At most, it can only be attempted rape, if not acts of lasciviousness. This was the ruling of the Supreme Court in the case of People versus Butiong, a 2011 case. The next question to ask is, what is a hymen and where is it located? Because in the previous slide or slides, I was not able to mention the hymen. But In this slide, we will focus on the hymen in order for us to evaluate whether or not the hymen is an important element in the crime of rape. Now, the hymen is a thin, fleshy tissue that's located at the opening of the vagina. Many people think the hymen totally covers the opening of the vagina until it is stretched open, but that is not usually the case. Most of the time, hymens naturally have a hole big enough for menstrual blood to come out. Some women are born with so little hymenal tissue that it seems like they don't have a hymen at all. In rare cases, women have hymens that cover the entire vaginal opening, or the hole in their hymen is very small. Just like other parts of the human body, hymens are a little different for everyone. As you can see in this picture, there are 5 hymen types. We have the imperforate hymen, which totally covers the vaginal opening. We also have the annular hymen, which has a little hole, a single hole in it. We have the septate hymen, which has 2 elongated holes. We also have the cribiform hymen, which is composed of, or which has several holes in it, and the parus introitus hymen, which has a large opening and would seem like it does not cover the hymen, or rather it does not cover the vaginal opening at all. Moreover, a hymen can be stretched open the first time a woman has vaginal sex, which might cause some pain or bleeding, but this doesn't happen to everyone. And there are other ways that a hymen can be stretched open, like for example riding a bike, doing sports, or putting something in the vagina, like a tampon, finger, or a sex toy. Once the hymen is stretched open, it can no longer grow back. The next question to ask is, should the hymen be ruptured, broken, or lacerated in order to convict an accused of rape? The answer is no. In the case of People versus Pamintuan, the Supreme Court said that the presence of lacerations in the hymen is not necessary to prove rape. Lack of lacerated wounds does not negate sexual intercourse. A freshly broken hymen is not essential in the crime of rape. Even the fact that the medical report states that the hymen of the victim was still intact does not negate rape. There are hymens that may admit a penis without necessarily producing laceration, and there are hymens that admit a penis that will produce a laceration. Medical findings suggest that it is possible for the victim's hymen to remain intact despite repeated sexual intercourse. The strength and dilatability of the hymen varies from one woman to another, such that it may be so elastic as to stretch without laceration during intercourse. On the other hand, it may be so resistant that its surgical removal is necessary before intercourse can ensue. So this is a very important ruling of the Supreme Court. This now emphasizes and stresses out the principle that the hymen is not an essential element to prove or to disprove the crime of rape. Another question: does the absence of seminal fluid or spermatozoa in or inside the victim's vagina negate rape? The answer is no. The presence or absence of seminal fluid is immaterial, since it is penetration, not ejaculation, which constitutes the crime of rape. Besides, the absence of the seminal fluid from the vagina could be due to a number of factors, such as the vertical drainage of the semen from the vagina, the acidity of the vagina, or simply the washing of the vagina after the sexual intercourse. The presence of spermatozoa is not an element of the crime of rape, as ruled in the case of People versus Alberca. When is rape committed in the attempted stage? Or meron bang attempted rape? The answer is yes. But in order to properly understand what attempted rape is, we must first review what consummated rape is. I have already discussed this decision of the Supreme Court in my previous slides. But again, no, for a proper understanding of what attempted rape is, we must learn by heart what consummated rape is in the first place. Now, to repeat, the labia majora or minora must be entered for rape to be consummated, and not merely for the penis to stroke the surface of the female organ. Thus, a grazing of the surface of the female organ or touching the mons pubis is not enough to constitute consummated rape, such that absent any showing of the slightest penetration of the female organ, meaning to say the touching of either labia of the pudendum by the penis, either labia majora or labia minora, there can be no consummated rape. At most, it can only be attempted rape, if not acts of lasciviousness. So, to repeat, pag hindi na-touch or walang contact yung penis dun sa labia majora or labia minora or vaginal opening ng victim, yung contact lang is on the mons pubis or meron lang stroking of the surface of the female organ, that will not be enough to consummate the crime of rape. Kung hindi nangyari yun, walang touching of the penis with either labia of the vagina of the woman, attempted rape lang yan, if not acts of lasciviousness. For attempted rape, the accused must have commenced the commission of overt acts showing his intent to lie, meaning intent to have sexual intercourse with the woman, but for some cause or accident other than his own spontaneous desistance, such intent was not consummated. Here, not even the slightest penetration happened. Example number 1. X saw Y sleeping. He then took off his shorts, placed himself on top of Y, and pulled down her shorts and panty. While X was about to insert his penis on Y's vagina, the latter was awakened. X then threatened Y with a knife, but because of Y's continued shouting and offering of resistance, a neighbor came to her rescue. Here, the crime of rape was not consummated, not because of his spontaneous resistance, but because of some cause or accident that forced him to discontinue his felonious act, which in this case happened when a neighbor came to rescue Y. But clearly, in this example, it shows the intent of X to have sexual intercourse with Y because, as can be read from the facts, X was about to insert his penis on Y's vagina. Example number 2. X lied on top of Y, embraced her, kissed her, and mashed her breasts. While these are obscene and detestable acts, they do not constitute attempted rape. Why? Because there was no showing that X actually commenced to force his penis into Y's sexual organ. Here, X is liable only for acts of lasciviousness. Take note, however, that had X inserted his finger in Y's vagina, he will be liable instead for the crime of sexual assault under the second paragraph of Article 266-A. Now, you might be wondering, Fiscal, can you discuss to us or bakit hindi mo dinidiscuss yung sexual assault? I will discuss the crime of sexual assault in my succeeding video or videos. But for now, let us concentrate first on the first kind of rape, which is simple rape under the first paragraph of 266-A. Example number 3. X saw Y lying unconscious. He then took off his shorts, placed himself on top of Y, pulled down her shorts and panty, and started kissing her breasts. When X was about to insert his penis on Y's vagina, he was struck by his conscience and immediately left. Should X here be liable or be held liable for the crime of attempted rape? The answer is no. X here is only liable for acts of lasciviousness because while he was not able to perform all the acts of execution, he was not able to do so not because of some cause or accident like what happened in the first example when a neighbor came to the rescue of Y. He was not able to perform or he was not able to consummate the crime of rape because he himself spontaneously desisted. He was struck by his conscience. No one prevented him from consummating the criminal act. It was his decision to desist from his felonious act. So, if there was spontaneous desistance, then it cannot be considered as attempted rape. Can he be held liable for some other crime? Yes. Instead of attempted rape, he will be liable instead for the crime of acts of lasciviousness. The next question to ask is, can rape be committed in the frustrated stage? Or meron bang frustrated rape? Bear in mind that for rape to be consummated, perfect penetration is not essential. Even the slightest penetration of the female organ by the male organ is sufficient. Entry of the labia or lips of the vagina, even without rupture or laceration of the hymen, is enough to constitute consummated rape. Hence, there can be no frustrated stage in rape because even if there was no actual or complete penetration of the female organ, the offender is deemed to have performed all the acts of execution and to have produced the felony as a consequence. This is the reason why there cannot be frustrated rape, because even if there was no penile or full penile penetration, for as long as the penis is in contact with the lips of the vagina, or more so, in contact with the vaginal opening, even if there was no actual entry into the vaginal opening or orifice of the woman, the crime is already consummated. And rape is attempted if there is no penetration at all, not even the slightest penetration. Because without the slightest penetration, the offender is deemed to have not performed all the acts of execution. Let's go to the third element. And what is that third element? That such act is accomplished under any of the following circumstances. What is the act being referred to here? The act of a man having carnal knowledge of a woman. Now, this is a very important element because this is what constitutes rape. Because if a man simply has carnal knowledge of a woman with the consent of the woman, then there can be no rape. So the third element will show us how rape is committed. And rape is committed under any of the following circumstances. Letter A, through force, threat, or intimidation. Letter B, when the woman is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious. Letter C, by means of fraudulent machination or grave abuse of authority. And letter D, when the offended party is under 12 years of age or is demented, even though none of the circumstances mentioned above be present. First way of committing the crime of rape, that is through force, threat, or intimidation. The physical force used in the commission of rape need not be overpowering or absolutely irresistible as ruled in the case of People versus Ramos. However, it must be sufficient to consummate the purposes which the offender had in mind. In People versus Sabillano, the Supreme Court said that it is not necessary that the physical force employed against the complaining woman in rape be so great or of such a character as could not be resisted. It is enough that the force used is sufficient to consummate the culprit's purpose of copulating with the offended woman. The force or violence necessary in rape is naturally a relative term depending on the age, size, and strength of the parties and their relation to each other. For example, suddenly X seized Y from behind by holding her shoulders and neck and forced her to lie down. Y tried to shout, but X covered her mouth with his left hand. She resisted the assault by kicking, slapping, and boxing X and scratching him on the face, but she succumbed to the superior force employed by X. X succeeded in pinning her down to the ground. Weakened considerably by her struggle and resistance and the persistent force employed by X, he succeeded in placing himself on top of her. X then unzipped his pants with his left hand, exposed his penis, removed her panty, and had sexual intercourse with her. Clearly here, the force used was sufficient to consummate X's purpose. On the other hand, threat or intimidation must produce fear that if the victim does not yield to the bestial demands of the accused or of the offender, something would happen to her at the moment or even thereafter. For example, X, with the use of a knife, threatens Y with death if she does not yield to his bestial desires. Y, fearing for her life, offered no resistance, for which reason X succeeded in having carnal knowledge of her. In the case of People versus Layoso, the Supreme Court said that the test is whether the threat or intimidation produces a reasonable fear in the mind of the victim that if she resists or does not yield to the desires of the accused, the threat would be carried out, as shown by my example, where resistance would be futile. Offering none at all does not amount to consent to the sexual assault. It is not necessary that the victim should have resisted unto death or sustained physical injuries in the hands of the rapist. It is enough if the intercourse takes place against her will, or if she yields because of genuine apprehension of harm to her if she did not do so. Indeed, the law does not impose upon a rape victim the burden of proving resistance. Question: does lack of physical resistance an essential element of the crime of rape? The Supreme Court answered that question in this wise. In the case of People versus Pareja, the Supreme Court said, a person accused of a serious crime such as rape will tend to escape liability by shifting the blame on the victim for failing to manifest resistance to sexual abuse. However, no clear-cut behavior can be expected of a person being raped. It is a settled rule that failure of the victim to shout or seek help does not negate the crime of rape. Even lack of resistance will not imply that the victim has consented to the sexual act, especially when that person was intimidated into submission by the offender. A victim should never be faulted for her lack of resistance to any forms of crime, particularly as grievous as rape. Failure to shout or offer tenacious resistance does not make voluntary the victim's submission to the perpetrator's lust. Besides, physical resistance is not the sole test to determine whether a woman involuntarily succumbed to the lust of an accused. It is not an essential element of rape. Rape victims react differently when confronted with sexual abuse. Thus, the law does not impose upon the private complainant or the victim the burden of proving resistance. This was ruled in the case of People versus Barberan and De Los Santos, a 2016 case. Still, in the case of People versus Palanay, the Supreme Court said that rape victims react differently. Some may offer strong resistance while others may be too intimidated to offer any resistance at all. There is no standard form of reaction, take note, for a woman when facing a shocking and horrifying experience such as a sexual assault or rape. The workings of the human mind placed under emotional stress are unpredictable, and people react differently. Some may shout, some may faint, and some may be shocked into insensibility, while others may openly welcome the intrusion. However, any of these conducts does not impair the credibility of a rape victim. Now, take note that even if there is no express mention in Article 266-A, Paragraph 1, of the element of moral ascendancy or influence, there is still rape, even if the offender did not employ physical force, threat, or intimidation, but he had moral ascendancy or influence over the victim, forcing the victim to submit to his bestial desires. So moral ascendancy here, or moral influence, takes the place of physical force or threat or intimidation. Now, these are examples of instances where an offender has moral ascendancy over his victim or moral influence. A father raping his daughter, a grandfather raping his granddaughter, a stepfather raping his stepdaughter, an uncle raping his niece, or a godfather raping his goddaughter. The Supreme Court has, in numerous cases, ruled that in these situations or instances, the offender has moral ascendancy or influence over his victim. And in such a case, it is not necessary that the prosecution prove that there was physical force or threat or intimidation employed by the offender in these cases. Hence, when the offender has moral ascendancy or influence over his victim, even if the latter does not put up a determined resistance, rape is still committed. Moral ascendancy or influence takes the place of force, threat, or intimidation. Now, in People versus Burce, the Supreme Court explained or kind of emphasized what moral ascendancy is. It said, in Philippine society, the father is considered the head of the family, and the children are taught not to defy the father's authority even when this is abused. They are taught to respect the sanctity of marriage and to value the family above everything else. Hence, when the abuse begins, the victim sees no reason or need to question the righteousness of the father whom she had trusted right from the start. The value of respect and obedience to parents instilled among Filipino children is transferred into the very same value that exposes them to risks of exploitation by their own parents. The sexual relationship could begin so subtly that the child does not realize that it is abnormal. Physical force then becomes unnecessary. The perpetrator takes full advantage of this blood relationship. Most daughters cooperate, and this is one reason why they suffer tremendous guilt later on. It is almost impossible for a daughter to reject her father's advances, for children seldom question what grown-ups tell them to do. Second way of committing rape, when the woman is deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious. Now here, the offender has carnal knowledge of a woman who is deprived of reason, or he has carnal knowledge of a woman who at the time of sexual intercourse was unconscious. In the rape of a woman deprived of reason or otherwise unconscious, the victim has no will. The absence of will determines the existence of the rape. Now, in People versus Castillo, the Supreme Court said that the term deprived of reason is associated with insanity or madness. A person deprived of reason has mental abnormalities that affect his or her reasoning and perception of reality, and therefore his or her capacity to resist, make decisions, and give consent. For example, a sexual intercourse with an insane woman is rape, as ruled in the case of People versus Aison. The deprivation of reason, however, does not need to be complete. Mental abnormality or deficiency is sufficient. So, even if the victim is not totally deprived of reason, but there is sufficient medical evidence to prove that there was absence of will on the part of the victim, meaning the victim could not intelligently give his consent, or has no perception of reality, or has no perception of what is right and wrong, then that will still be considered as being deprived of reason. In the following cases, there is rape because the woman is unconscious. Number 1, sexual intercourse with a woman who was asleep. Number 2, when the woman is in a lethargy produced by sickness. When you say lethargy, the person is in a pathological state of sleepiness or deep unresponsiveness and inactivity. Number 3, when the victim is in a state of coma. Or number 4, after the woman was knocked unconscious, the offender had carnal knowledge of her. Or when a narcotic drug was administered to the woman, but not where consent is induced by the administration of drugs or liquor, which incites her passions but does not deprive her of her willpower. Or number 6, when a potion is given to a woman and as a result of which she felt dizzy and experienced a sudden loss of control over her person, and thereafter she was abused. Third way of committing rape, that is by means of fraudulent machination or grave abuse of authority. Fraudulent machination here means a scheming or crafty action intended to accomplish an evil end. As a means of committing rape, the offender employs plots and or schemes to deceive or induce his victim to submit to sexual intercourse. For example, X has an identical twin brother named Y. X is married to Z. One night, the twin brothers had a drinking spree at X's house. Z, the wife of X, likewise drank but consumed only one bottle of beer and thereafter left to go to her room and to sleep. Y put some narcotic in X's drink, causing the latter to fall asleep. Y then went to Z's room, turned the lights off, and, pretending to be Z's husband, succeeded in having sexual intercourse with Z. Here, Y employed a scheme to deceive or induce his victim. First, he put a narcotic on his twin brother's drink to make the husband, his very own twin brother X, fall asleep. Then, he went to the room of the couple, turned off the lights, and made it appear that he was the husband of Z, when in truth and in fact, he was only the twin brother of X. So, this is a very clear example of what fraudulent machination is. While in this example, the victim Z freely gave her consent, she gave her consent because she was made to believe that the offender was her husband. On the other hand, grave abuse of authority as applied to rape cases was shown in the case of People versus Valencia. In that case, the Supreme Court said that the accused appellant gravely abused his parental authority, particularly his disciplinary authority over his daughter Nene, and used it to further his lechery. The Supreme Court further said that in incestuous rape cases, the father's abuse of the moral ascendancy and influence over his daughter can subjugate the latter's will, thereby forcing her to do whatever he wants. His moral and physical domination is sufficient to cow his daughter into submission to his beastly desires. In this case, Nene feared her father, and in fact, the accused himself admitted in his testimony that he was a cruel husband and a cruel father, and that he treated his wife and children harshly. Fourth way of committing rape, that is, when the woman is under 12 years of age or demented, even though none of the circumstances mentioned above be present. This basically refers to the crime of statutory rape because it is more popularly known by that name, statutory rape. Now, how is statutory rape committed? It is committed when, number one, the offended party is under 12 years of age, and number two, the accused has carnal knowledge of her, regardless of whether there was force, threat, or intimidation, whether the victim was deprived of reason or consciousness, or whether it was done through fraud or grave abuse of authority. Here, it is enough that the age of the victim is proven and that there was sexual intercourse. In the case of People versus Diniega, the Supreme Court said that rape under Article 266-A, Paragraph 1D of the Revised Penal Code as amended is termed statutory rape as it departs from the usual modes of committing rape. What the law punishes in statutory rape is carnal knowledge of a woman below 12 years old. Thus, force, intimidation, and physical evidence of injury are not relevant considerations. The only subject of inquiry is the age of the woman and whether carnal knowledge took place. The law presumes that the victim does not and cannot have a will of her own on account of her tender years. The child's consent here is immaterial because of her presumed incapacity to discern good from evil. What are the guidelines in appreciating the victim's age in rape cases? These are the guidelines. Number one, the best evidence to prove the age of the victim is an original or certified true copy of the certificate of live birth of the said victim. Or number two, in the absence of a certificate of live birth, similar authentic documents such as baptismal certificate and school records which show the date of birth of the victim would suffice to prove age. Another is if the certificate of live birth or authentic document is shown to have been lost or destroyed or otherwise unavailable, the testimony, if clear and credible, of the victim's mother or a member of the family, either by affinity or consanguinity, who is qualified to testify on matters respecting pedigree pursuant to the rules on evidence, shall be sufficient. Or number four, in the absence of a certificate of live birth, authentic document, or the testimony of the victim's mother or relatives concerning the victim's age, the complainant's testimony will suffice provided it is expressly and clearly admitted by the accused. Or number five, it is the prosecution that has the burden of proving the age of the offended party, such that the failure of the accused to object to the testimonial evidence regarding age shall not be taken against him. And of course, the trial court should always make a categorical finding as to the age of the victim. So these guidelines were cited by the Supreme Court in the case of People versus Buado, and this should be the guideline when appreciating the age of a victim, especially when answering the question of whether or not there was statutory rape. Because in statutory rape, it must be sufficiently proved that the victim was below 12 years old when the offender had carnal knowledge of her. But don't forget that statutory rape is likewise committed when the offender has carnal knowledge of a woman who is demented. Demented refers to a person who suffers from a mental condition called dementia. Dementia refers to the deterioration or loss of mental functions such as memory, learning, speaking, and social condition, which impairs one's independence in everyday activities. This was cited in the case of People versus Castillo. Take note that the demented woman does not have to be less than 12 years of age at the time of carnal knowledge to be considered statutory rape. Hence, for as long as there is sufficient medical evidence that the woman was suffering from dementia when the offender had carnal knowledge of her, the crime is deemed committed. Question: what if the victim of rape is a mental retardate? Under what paragraph of Article 266-A does the rape of a mental retardate fall? In People versus Castillo, the Supreme Court en banc, take note, citing the earlier cases of People versus Diniega, People versus Niebres, and People versus Quintos, held that sexual intercourse with a mental retardate whose mental age is below 12 years old constitutes statutory rape under paragraph 1D, Article 266-A of the Revised Penal Code, and not under paragraph 1B, Article 266-A, which is the rape of a woman who is deprived of reason. Why is that so? The Supreme Court explained that while the term mental retardation had been previously classified under deprived of reason, that should not be the case. A mental retardate is different from a person who is deprived of reason and from a person suffering from dementia. The Supreme Court said that the term deprived of reason should be associated with insanity. Hence, a person deprived of reason has mental abnormalities that affect his or her reasoning and perception of reality, and therefore his or her capacity to resist, make decisions, and give consent, like the case of an insane woman. On the other hand, the term demented refers to a person who suffers from a mental condition called dementia. Dementia refers to the deterioration or loss of mental function such as memory, learning, speaking, and social condition, which impairs one's independence in everyday activities. Now, a mental retardate, on the other hand, or what we call an intellectually disabled person, is not necessarily deprived of reason or demented. Take note of this. They can even be credible witnesses according to the Supreme Court. However, his or her maturity is not there despite the physical age. He or she is deficient in general mental abilities and has an impaired conceptual, social, and practical functioning relative to his or her age, gender, and peers. Because of such impairment, he or she does not meet the socio-cultural standards of personal independence and social responsibility. So, pinakita dito ng Supreme Court in the case of People versus Castillo na iba yung ibig sabihin ng deprived of reason, iba din yung ibig sabihin ng demented person, and iba din yung ibig sabihin ng mental retardate. Hindi ibig sabihin na mental retardate ka, you are already deprived of reason, because a mental retardate can even be a witness in a case. Ang situation lang ng isang mental retardate is deficient yung kanyang general mental abilities vis-a-vis her physical age. For example, a person with a chronological age of 7 years and a normal mental age also of 7 years is as capable of making decisions and giving consent as a person with a chronological age of 35 and a mental age of 7. Both are considered incapable of giving rational consent because both are not yet considered to have reached the level of maturity that gives them the capacity to make rational decisions, especially on matters involving sexuality. Furthermore, the Supreme Court said that decision-making is a function of the mind. Hence, a person's capacity to decide whether to give consent or to express resistance to an adult activity is determined not by his or her chronological age, but by his or her mental age. Therefore, take note of this. In determining whether a person is 12 years of age under Article 266-A, Paragraph 1D, the interpretation should be in accordance with either the chronological age of the child, if he or she is not suffering from intellectual disability, or the mental age if intellectual disability is established. It is now clear, therefore, that carnal knowledge of a mental retardate whose mental age is below 12 years old constitutes statutory rape under Paragraph 1D, Article 266-A of the Revised Penal Code, and not under Paragraph 1B of the said article. Question: what about Fiscal, yung carnal knowledge of a mental retardate whose mental age is 12 years old and above. Under what paragraph of Article 266-A does the crime fall? Answer, it will fall under either paragraph 1A. I am referring to the first way of committing rape, or first mode of committing rape, which is through force, threat, or intimidation. Take note that when the offender has moral ascendancy or influence over the victim, proof of force, threat, or intimidation is immaterial. Or it may fall under paragraph 1C, that is, by means of fraudulent machination or grave abuse of authority. The following instances will not negate the crime of rape. Lack of resistance. So even if the offended party did not resist or merely offered a token resistance, it will not negate the crime of rape, especially when the accused is the father or when the accused is closely related to the victim, such that moral ascendancy or influence substitutes for physical violence, force, intimidation, or threat. Also, the fact that the victim was no longer a virgin when the offender had sexual intercourse with her will not affect the victim's credibility. Because even if the woman is a prostitute, for example, for as long as all the elements are present, the crime is committed. Even a wife can lodge a complaint against her husband because there is such a thing as marital rape. Also, the absence of lacerations in the hymen will not negate rape because the mere touching of an erect penis with either labia of the pudendum of the victim is enough to consummate the crime. Or the fact that there was no medical certificate will not negate rape because a medical report is by no means controlling. A medical examination of the victim is not indispensable in the prosecution for rape, and no law requires a medical examination for the successful prosecution thereof. The medical examination of the victim or the presentation of the medical certificate is not essential to prove rape, as the testimony of the victim alone, if credible, is sufficient to convict the accused of the crime. And finally, the absence of spermatozoa or seminal fluid will also not affect the credibility of the victim, or it will not negate rape because it is penetration, not ejaculation, which constitutes the crime of rape. Besides, the absence of the seminal fluid from the vagina could be due to a number of factors such as drainage of the semen from the vagina, or the acidity of the vagina, or simply the washing of the vagina after the sexual intercourse.